welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club. The Socratic Club models itself on the Oxford Socratic Club, which was presided over by famous Christian apologist C.S. Lewis in the 1940s and 50s at Oxford University. And we follow their model of addressing Christian worldview issues in a critical, reflective, philosophical way. Their motto was to follow the argument wherever it leads, and that's what we try to do as well. We meet about once a month, and as I said, if you're interested in keeping up with what we do, sign up on the listserv list, and we'll send you an occasional email. I promise we won't fill your inbox. We are talking today about religion naturalized. Science is an enormously powerful force in our culture. Some would say science has eclipsed many other of the sort of influential forces in Western culture, like religion, for example. And of course, one practice of science is to use the tools and methods of scientific analysis on anything and everything. So we have increasingly seen scientific analysis devoted to a range of human phenomena, certainly the cosmos, biology, but increasingly human behavior and human mental cognitive development in sociology and in psychology. And increasingly over the last 30 or 40 years, scientists have been interested in exploring the phenomena of religion, religious behavior, religious practices, religious beliefs, using scientific tools. And so we want to ask the question about this procedure and its promise and possibilities and perhaps limitations. So that's our topic for the day. This is an unusual Socratic club because it is the work of planning by a philosophy student, Mr. Joshua Haxton, who came up with the topic and secured the panelists who we have here today to speak. And so we want to thank Mr. Haxton. Excellent work for that. And it's a first, but a great idea for the Socratic Club. We do have 3 speakers today, all Gonzaga faculty, 2 from philosophy and 1 from religious studies. Dr. Mark Alfino got his degree from the University of Texas at Austin and specializes in language and value and regularly teaches courses on happiness and wisdom. Dr. Dan Bradley, who is also in the philosophy department, got his degree from his PhD degree from the National University of Ireland, and has been here for
4 years.
4 years now. Okay, and his interests are in phenomenology and continental thought, and especially the application of phenomenology and continental thought to philosophy of religion. So he has some interests that are directly connected with our topic for today. Dr. Joseph Mudd is somewhat new to the university. He's in the religious studies department, came here in 2010, and now I've forgotten your degree is Boston College. I'm sorry, I wrote it down on my piece of paper and left it up there. So degree in Boston College, and his specialty is in liturgical and sacramental theology. And all 3 of our speakers are going to address the topic of naturalizing religion. They'll have a little bit of an interchange in between them with some comments, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So let's begin. Dr. Alfino is going to start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just go ahead and okay, thanks for coming out for this. It's great to see familiar faces. So what I have is a very short précis for you, and I'm recording it so you can see it later and listen to it, or you can get some of the information off the précis you might want to get later. I could actually use a volunteer. Maybe Marco, could you volunteer? Yeah.
That's not called a volunteer.
You had a choice. You could have said no, you could have run out of the room, you should have So you just kind of click us through here, and then I can get out from behind the podium. That's okay.
Like the signal would do?
Yeah, it's going to be kind of intuitive. We're just going to Yeah, if you're way off, if you're way off, I'll let you know. All right, cool. Okay, so my treatment of the topic is going to be brief, and it might be somewhat tangential. I'm going to actually just try to identify one value of the scientific study of religion. So my question, there are a lot of questions in the prompt, they're really interesting. I'll say a couple of things about some of the other questions in the prompt at the end, real quick. But I just picked maybe this one question. What is the value of scientific study of religion? Okay, so let's, and I think if you click on allow, you get rid of that little thing up. Okay, yeah, now wipes. Okay. So, basically we've got a variety of disciplines that have produced important research in the last 15 or 20 years. And my thesis is that this knowledge helps us with one of the biggest problems in culture today. And since we have an economist in the room, I have to mention that this includes behavioral economics, people applying game theory to explanations of culture. It's a lot of new knowledge, and of course if you know about research, you know that we have to be suspicious about new knowledge. So when I say this is exciting new knowledge of the last 15 or 20 years, since there's enough faculty in the room, I'm reminded to add the caveat that new knowledge is inherently suspicious. Most new results are actually disproven. But it's still exciting. And it's exciting because it paints a picture, a cohesive picture from a variety of disciplines that looks like it could be the basis of a new kind of exploration of culture and religion. So let's see, my claim then that I have to make good on is that this knowledge helps us with one of the biggest problems facing culture regarding religion today. So I should tell you what I think one of the biggest problems facing culture today is. That's the problem of religious conflict and hostility arising from the view that religious folks and non-religious folks take of each other, as well as the view that religious folks adopt of other religious folks. And just to kind of keep this light, we'll just say maybe that religious folks are ERFs, and non-religious folks are NERFs, and other religious folks are ORFs. Now today we're not going to talk about ORFs, but we're going to talk about NERFs and ERFs. And I'm going to talk about some NERFs and ERFs. So when I refer to them, I don't mean all. Okay? So what I want to say is that the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems we face today is religious conflict and hostility, and that has to do with the view that ERFs and NERFs take of each other. And I want to bring naturalism in again here. I want to say that recent scientific study of religion challenges many of the assumptions that defenders and critics of religion have suggested, and offers valuable resources for ERFs and NERFs to form better theories of each other's experience. Okay, so let's look at a couple of standard ERF-NERF hypotheses. It's okay to laugh when you hear ERF and NERF. It's kind of fun. So here's something the NERFs say to ERFs a lot. ERFs don't think consistently about evidence for their beliefs in divine beings and processes. If they did, they would stop being religious. That's a pretty standard claim that NERFs make about ERFs. Here's another standard claim that ERFs make about NERFs. Remember, I'm just picking one. I'm not saying that all ERFs and NERFs say this, but you hear this. NERFs are blind to a range of human experiences that include evidence of divine beings and processes, and the importance of worship. We should pray for them. I'm trying to keep it parallel. So those are standard ERF-NERF hypotheses, and what I want to suggest is that there are some better ERF-NERF hypotheses on the table now that we have new knowledge, even though it is just new knowledge. So let's take a look at some of the better ERF-NERF hypotheses. This is something NERFs should say about ERFs. Religious experience often involves powerful emotions and profound beliefs about reality that are possible in part because of existing cognitive and social capacities that emerge through evolution. NERFs, this is something ERFs should say about NERFs. NERFs use many of the same cognitive and social capacities as ERFs. Oh, by the way, I should point out this, the press will be available at alfino.org, so if you don't want to take notes right now, ERFs should say this about NERFs. NERFs use many of the same cognitive and social capacities as ERFs to create and maintain meaningfulness or have spiritual experiences, but they do not typically commit themselves in a community to beliefs about divine beings or processes. So, the question becomes, Marco, Thank you. Sorry, snuck up on you that time. What is the difference between standard and better nerf-earth hypothesis? What makes the difference between standard and better earth-nerf hypotheses? It's not that the standard ones are false. Now, in scientific work, hypotheses garner evidence, and they can have evidence even if they turn out not to be the most fruitful hypotheses. So let's go ahead and answer the question. In fact, the standard hypotheses can be supported by personal experience and objective evidence. We could go back and look at that if you want later. These hypotheses are not false. They do not fail to garner evidence. There are nerfs who are blind to religious experience. We could say more sympathetically that they just don't have religious experience. In fact, many people have religious experience at some point in their life and then stop having it. So that's really not that implausible a thing to say about a nerf. It's not the nicest way to put it. You could just say the switch went off, right? Okay? But it's not that the standard hypotheses don't have evidence. You can also find earths who I think fail to be consistent about evidence and belief enough. But the standard hypotheses focus too much on cognitive and affective deficits. In other words, both of them are really accusations that the other group is kind of messed up. You know? They're either not seeing something about the beauty of transcendent reality, or they're not thinking well, right? And that's how the new atheist criticisms of religious folks come across, that they're not thinking well. So my criticism of the standard hypotheses isn't that there isn't evidence for them, but rather that they involve making an attribution of affective and cognitive deficits that isn't plausible. I have no reason to think that earths and nerves suffer from widespread affective and cognitive deficits. So, what I think is better about the earth-nerve hypotheses that I offered is that I think the better hypotheses are informed by new knowledge of religion and culture in the natural and social sciences. This knowledge provides a basis for mutual respect between earths and nerves in the shared evolutionary history that makes religious and non-religious, related religious and non-religious experiences possible. Remember, earths and nerves don't have completely disparate experiences, do they? And which better explains why and how people are religious. So I wanted to just close by suggesting 5 ways that scientific study of religion promotes better earth-nerve hypotheses. I'm sorry, if you came in late, you probably think we're talking about imaginary creatures or something. We're just talking about religious folks and non-religious folks. So, first, anthropology of religion suggests that religious beliefs do real work for cultures, that they did real work for cultures in our ancestral environment, and that they do real work for cultures today. There are huge advantages to being religious. Second, neuropsychology of religion has documented brain state changes associated with both religious and non-religious contemplative states like prayer and meditation. Third, psychology and sociology of religion help explain why religions are effective in promoting human well-being in spite of the great diversity of beliefs they involve. That's a puzzle for herbs and forks. 4, studies of theological correctness suggest that earths keep 2 sets of books in maintaining coherence between 2 systems of causation, basically, spiritual and natural. At least when things go well, they keep 2 sets of books. 5, research on very young children has documented an inborn bias toward thinking of agents as immortal. Religion is very natural to us from a very early age. So those are 5 leads that we could pursue if we wanted in discussion. I don't know how appropriate that would be. I just wanted, this is just, you can click through this, one more and just pause. This is just a short bibliography of stuff that I'm referring to when I talk about scientific and social science knowledge of religion. So I want to just conclude with 2 slides. The first has to do with my presentation. The second, as I told you, I'd say something about some parts of the prompt that I didn't respond to. So, my conclusion should be pretty straightforward for now. Recent science of religion gives earths and nerves new and more productive ways of thinking about each other's experience. science validates many aspects of religious experience. I think that's really important. I think in a lot of the more angry or noisy conversations on religion and science, we lose sight of the fact that especially new knowledge across a wide range of disciplines about science and culture really validate a lot of what's going on in religious experience. And that's great news for everybody. Hopefully that'll lead to new understanding and respect among all parties. Second conclusion, scientific research on religion no longer engages questions about the existence of supernatural beings or processes. These questions used to motivate scientific and philosophical culture, but they no longer do. Okay, then I'd like to say something about a part of the prompt that may occupy more of our attention in the discussion in the question period. But that was actually everything I wanted to say about IRFs and NERFs. So the second thing I wanted to do was respond to this part of the prompt here. Most basic is the question of whether scientific accounts of religious behavior are or should be construed as reductive, that is, as exhaustively capturing what is going on in religious activity. In other words, can religious activity be naturalized or described in terms of natural events and phenomena? And just a couple of quick comments. We can take this up in discussion. I don't understand the use of reductive in the first sentence. I went and did a little looking, and I think I understand how the person who wrote that is meaning it now. So maybe we could discuss that. In any case, I don't think sciences are reductive in this sense. I'd like to hear more about that. The second sentence looks like it restates the first sentence, but it's really a very, very different question. It's really the question of whether you can produce naturalistic knowledge. For me, it's the question of whether you can produce naturalistic knowledge of religion. And for me, since there's no dispute that there is naturalistic knowledge of religion, it's not an interesting question. It's like asking if an African American could become president. You know, it was an interesting question, but for me, and I have to emphasize for me, because I could be using the words in a distinctive way. For me, it's not an interesting question anymore. It used to be. Okay, thanks very much.
Dr. Mudd's going to be second here. Go ahead.
Should I stand?
You can do whatever you'd like.
I will hide behind the So I'm actually going to pick up on Dr. Alfino's fourth way of keeping two books. Okay, so that's where I'm going to approach the question. So you might be wondering why I'm here. Why am I here? As Dr. Calhoun mentioned, my specialty is in liturgical and sacramental theology. And it's increasingly the case that theologians operating in that area of theological inquiry are utilizing the work of especially psychologists and social psychologists in their analysis of worship and prayer as sort of the maintenance of community within the context of church or the generation of particular affective states and things like that. So there's an emerging conversation between liturgical and sacramental theologians, and especially people in psychology. Not as much in neuroscience yet, but there may be at some point. So that's partially why I'm here. I'm also partially here because I was asked to be here. So I'm happy to participate. So the question before us regards, I would say, methods more than it does any position on a particular issue. So my comments are consequently methodological. How do scholars think is one question that has to be dealt with prior to asking how they think about any particular issue. Scholarly thinking is a particular type of thinking, so we have to talk about that if we're going to give an adequate answer to the prompt. So generally speaking, scholarly discourse is carried out in response to what we might call a systematic exegesis, that is a desire to understand systematically particular phenomena. That is to say that scholars, qua scholars, operate in an intellectual pattern of experience ordered toward understanding systematically all there is to be understood in response to a particular question. That is a particular way of patterning one's experience. It is not the pattern of the worshiper, for whom the systematic exigence recedes in the face of mystery. So when you're engaging in intellectual inquiry, you're using certain, asking certain kinds of questions that you're not always necessarily asking. And this is our problem, the problem between the state, perhaps, of the worshiper and the state of the scholar talking about worship. Those are two different things. Can scholars speak adequately about the phenomena we are calling religious experience in the same way they speak about geological formations or neuroscience? That is the relevant question at stake in our discussion at the level of methodology. It is the basic hermeneutical question about the position of the scholar in relation to the phenomena under consideration. I hesitate to speak about the phenomenon of religious experience in any general sense. Rather, I approach the question as a Catholic theologian whose area of study is the worship of the Church and its liturgy and sacraments. That does not mean, however, that I'm opposed to engaging in what used to be called natural theology. That's part of what theologians ought to do, is do natural theology as part of giving an account of one's hope, which is an important Christian duty. So, there are some who will argue that any phenomenon is explainable according to the methods developed in modern scientific analysis since the 16th century. Those methods depend on observation, and therefore on observable data. And certainly there are observable data on the phenomenon we're calling religious experience. For example, there are certain Christians for whom the gift of the Holy Spirit manifests in speaking in tongues. Or we might talk about brain scans of people in the midst of prayer, and that there are certain data that emerge there. So there are data on religious experience. Scholars of religion, anthropologists, psychologists, and philosophers have many things to say about such phenomena. What has been, until relatively recently, more difficult to observe is religious experience as a purely internal phenomenon. But there again, developments in modern neuroscience can render, to some degree, what used to be internal, external. Right? Now we have observable data on internal states. But those studies do not explain religious experience. Rather, they explain that religious experience, howsoever defined, is observable according to certain data, certain impulses in the brain, for example. Right? That's not the experience. That's data that's emerging from an experience. Such explanations say nothing about the images generated by such experiences or the origins of certain feelings, although if you're doing sort of, there are places where people in terms of neurobiology would want to talk about feelings as emerging from hormonal secretions or things like that. But then you got to ask the further question, why did the hormones secrete? Let's see. So such studies are very helpful for scholars of religion as they work toward a systematic understanding of religious experience in its subjective aspects, which obviously includes, for example, events in the brains and all kinds of bodily phenomena. But I think the real crux of the problem that's sort of lurking underneath the questions is to ask, is religious experience purely subjective and therefore reducible to neurological or psychological analyses? Or is religious experience an experience of some reality that exceeds human nature? I think that's what the questions are pushing at. Is there anything out there? Is there something behind the smoke of the fire? To answer that question, we need to distinguish between nature then and supernature, and this is where I get into 2 books, and the methods for understanding each of those things. So, one of the most significant developments of medieval theology was called the theorem of the supernatural. And supernatural in this instance is not a reference to things like magic, right, or paranormal activity or spooky things generally. That's not what I mean by supernatural here. Rather, supernatural refers to an entitative order beyond some other nature. To take an example within the context of the created order, chemical compounds are relatively supernatural to subatomic particles, and plants are relatively supernatural to chemical compounds. Each entitative order exceeds the previous order in a way that is relatively supernatural. The absolutely supernatural, however, exceeds nature in such a way that it exceeds the proportion of any finite substance to knowledge of it. Any knowledge of the absolutely supernatural is therefore necessarily analogical, and that's sort of the standard points of theological methods. That all you can have is analogical understanding of God if you're doing natural theology. Having made this distinction, we can say that there is a universe of being proportionate to human understanding, exercised through observation, definition, and affirmation, as in the scientific method. The Catholic theological tradition and other religious traditions similarly affirm the existence of an absolutely supernatural order that exceeds human understanding. On the other hand, the Catholic theological tradition has consistently affirmed that one can have certain analogical knowledge of the absolutely supernatural through the things of nature. And this comes out in the First Vatican Council's dogmatic constitution on the Catholic faith, which states that, quote, God, the source and end of all things, can be known with certainty from the consideration of created things by the natural power of human reason. Okay, so that's one affirmation that the Catholic theologian doing natural theology would want to make. On the other hand, Christians would also affirm, and this is how the First Vatican Council puts it, it was, however, pleasing to his wisdom and goodness for God to reveal himself in the eternal laws of his will to the human race by another, and that a supernatural way. So that's where special revelation comes into the conversation. So the document goes on to argue, again, this is the dogmatic constitution on the Catholic faith from the First Vatican Council, 1870. The perpetual agreement of the Catholic Church has maintained, and maintains this too, that there is a twofold order of knowledge, distinct not only as regards its source, but also as regards its object. With regard to the source, we know at the one level by natural reason, at the other level by divine faith. With regard to the object, besides those things to which natural reason can attain, there are proposed for our belief mysteries hidden in God, which, unless they are divinely revealed, are incapable of being known. So you have two distinct orders of knowing, which yield two different methods for knowing. So theological method is not the same as scientific method. And then two objects of knowledge, one supernatural and one natural. Faith argues, quote, even though faith is above reason, there can never be any real disagreement between faith and reason, since it is the same God who reveals the mysteries and infuses faith, and who has endowed the human mind with the light of reason. God cannot deny himself, nor can truth ever be in opposition to truth. Therefore, we define that every assertion contrary to the truth of enlightened faith is totally false. And this is where you might think some disagreement with scientists. So, based on those affirmations, the council goes on to indicate in helpful propositions and anathemas exactly what one should hold as a believer. So this is Canon 2, sub 1 of the First Vatican Council, Dogmatic Constitution of the Faith. If anyone says that one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known with certainty from the things that have been made by the natural light of human reason, let him be anathema. So it's a proposition of faith that you have to hold in the Catholic tradition, that you can have natural knowledge of God from things that are made. And then another canon, if anyone says that divine faith is not to be distinguished from natural knowledge about God and moral matters, and consequently that for divine faith it is not required that revealed truth should be believed because of the authority of God who reveals it, let it be anathema, which is indicating that there are two separate sources of knowledge. Okay? So it's important then for scholars of religion, when they enter into conversation with scientists, to give scientists their full and proper reign over the discourse, and not to try to intervene in the discourse and subvert the method of science. On the other hand, it would be imprudent for a scientist to use scientific method to operate on the contents of faith, which faith affirms to be strictly supernatural. And so when somebody says there's no evidence for God, the Christian should just say, exactly. Okay? Agreed. There are no data on God. And so then move on to the next part of the conversation. And so we can get further into perhaps how to render that adequately. But the key thing is that if you keep nature and revelation distinct, you can have natural knowledge of God and affirm something about some maximalist interpretation of causality or something like that. But that doesn't, traditionally there's this distinction between the God of philosophers and the God of faith. It's not always helpful sometimes if you look at too strict a separation. But they're operating on different pieces of, we might call them data, but strictly speaking for the theologian, there's no data on God. God doesn't have a lot. So I would want to affirm the fourth way that Dr. Alfino mentioned, but also then affirm all the real and genuine work that science can do in helping us to understand religion as a phenomenon, and also to urge greater collaboration with scientists, so among theologians and scientists, so that scientists don't go too far in the direction of making science sort of omnicompetent in all areas of human experience. It may not be. And I'll leave it at that.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. What are we to think of religion naturalized? I take this to be the question that we're asking today, and I'm very grateful to Mr. Haxton for bringing it up. I think it's a great question, particularly for us here at the Jesuit University. It's a very relevant question. I think it's very much of contemporary significance. In fact, it's so contemporary that it's beyond my area of expertise and my competence to talk about it, but I think I'm pretty good company, except for maybe Dr. Alfino. So I am delighted. Before I'm just going to read my remarks, but let me just try and tie into what's come before. What I'd like you to think about is these two books that we've heard about, or two methods for thinking about truth. My argument, I'm not sure exactly how it's going to relate to this, but at least one argument in this paper is going to be to say that the traditional modern way from Cartesian modernity onwards for thinking about truth is to say there's two spheres, and we might call this the non-overlapping magisteria way of thinking about truth. Science can talk about objective facts, it can talk about what's out there, it can talk about physical reality, but it can't talk about my subjective experiences. So religion is about subjectivity, and science can't talk about subjectivity. Well, I think naturalized religion explodes that kind of way of thinking about it. And so the metaphor, I think, instead of two sort of conflicts between equals, I would suggest that now, the naturalized religion suggests that science can talk about all aspects of religion, religious experience. And so if we're to think about there being a possibility for religious knowledge, it would have to be vertical rather than horizontal. So I would still think about two ways, or two books, but I see natural knowledge as leading upwards, the metaphor of upwards, towards theological knowledge. Anyway. I understand the question of what are we to think about religion naturalized. To me, what are we to think about the contemporary interest in naturalism as it's applied to religion? The proximate roots of this new movement, I think, is very, very alive in contemporary culture. It goes back, you could say, to 1969 with Quine's famous article, Epistemology Naturalized. It has really picked up speed in the last 15 or 20 years, as we've already heard. We've seen aesthetics naturalized, ethics naturalized, wisdom naturalized by our own Dr. Alfino, empathy naturalized by our own Dr. McClellan. So people are working on this here at Gonzaga. And so I take it that naturalism means trying to understand the world without appealing to anything supernatural or transcendent to the world, basically without an appeal to God. And I can't establish that in very, very fast 12 minutes. We can talk about that afterwards. Now, a non-naturalist explanation of religion, that when it's not naturalized, would appeal to a transcendent God which establishes the religion. So why is there religion? What causes religion? Well, according to the Jewish account, it's because God made a covenant with Abraham. Right? God is the cause of the religion. And this is true of all the great religions that we can think about. Some kind of heavenly powers or ultimate transcendent reality is the cause of the religion on a traditional understanding, whether that's of Buddhism or Islam or anything like that. But this is also true of other religions like Hinduism and North American religions, that we don't have time to talk about that. So how do you explain religion? Well, because God created it. But how do you explain religion on naturalistic terms if we've excluded appealing to God as a cause in the first place? How will you explain religion in naturalistic terms, if we mean by that not appealing to God? Well, this is not absolutely new. We've already seen naturalized attempts to explain religion, and what springs to mind for me are Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, the great masters of suspicion. They want to say, why is there religion? Well, not because God created it, but because of psychological and social and cultural factors, right? Why is there religion? Well, religion is an attempt for me to defend my own socioeconomic position in society. Why is there religion? Well, it's my resentment against the rich and the powerful. Why is there religion? Well, it's some kind of return of repressed desires from my childhood for protection and security. I think these are all very helpful for the theist, but they're helpful in the sense of purifying religion of illusions. They're showing places where God is not the cause, right? Something else is the cause, and we want to root that out of our own religious thinking and religious beliefs. But the current wave of interest in naturalizing religion, so if it's not different in kind, I think it's going to be different by offering very different tools for thinking about religion. Primarily, this is evolutionary psychology and perhaps also neuroscience. Neuroscience will reveal the neural correlates for different types of mental activity, prayer, liturgical worship, philosophical reflection on God's nature, etc. Evolutionary psychology will reveal the evolutionary pathways by which a belief in God arose over history, over historical time. And I think this is all very exciting and interesting for the religious thinker, taking Dr. Alfino's caveat that this is new, and so there probably will be problems with it as they emerge. But the older non-theistic explanations for religion, like those of Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, tended to be explanations of the unhealthy aspects of religion. But these evolutionary pathways and neural mechanisms are in some ways a much happier investigation, because they're open to explaining true religious belief. For presumably, wherever there's a mental or spiritual event, there's a material substrate that allows for that event. So our fMRIs will be able to tell us interesting things about the neural circuitry involved in prayer. Presumably, there's also a historical substrate to religious belief that will be uncovered through evolutionary psychology. I think this is one of the most interesting contemporary questions currently being worked on. It's important to note that this work is in its infancy. We've made very little progress so far. In fact, the most basic question that an evolutionary investigation of religion is going to ask is belief in religion adaptive? In other words, does this provide some kind of evolutionary advantage on the beings that hold it? Or is it the byproduct of other adaptive traits, like the tendency to see agency behind the activities we see in the world? Even that most basic one, as far as I understand, we haven't come to consensus on that. People hold different opinions. It seems likely to me that religious belief and practice will turn out to be an adaptive trait that binds communities together through a shared emotional experience, and thus opens the possibility for group selection of cooperative traits that benefit everyone, as long as you can convince the vast majority of people to go along with it and not have a lot of free riders. But I don't know, right? But this is, no matter what, this is going to be a major problem for those who tend to think of the relation between religion and science in terms of non-overlapping magisterium, by which we divide knowledge into scientific investigations of objective external facts on the one hand, and religious investigation of subjective personal belief on the other, which I think is the typical modern way of doing things. And it seems to me that religion naturalized is going to explode this view, the non-overlapping magisterium view. This is because the neuroscience and the new applications of evolutionary theory to human phenomena cannot be contained within any boundaries. There's nowhere that we can say this phenomenon is not open to your investigation. All phenomena, including very intimate, subjective human feelings and experiences, are going to be explained by science. Science is going to be able to explain the wonderful feeling of worship and praise by telling you how certain neuronal activity gives rise to it and how certain evolutionary pressures gave rise to that particular capacity. However, it seems equally clear to me that spiritual life cannot be reduced to the principles of biology any more than the principles of biology can be reduced to chemistry. A biochemist can give a detailed account of the Krebs cycle, by which aerobic organisms metabolize energy by breaking a carbon bond and turning acetate compounds into NADH, and eventually into ATP. You remember some of this something like that? But just because the chemist can explain how all these things happen, she will not fully understand why they are happening, and why they're happening all the time, all over the earth, as a chemist. To fully understand why these chemical processes are happening with such regularity and ubiquity, she will need to study biology in order to understand that this is a part of metabolism, providing the organism with energy. She'll have to understand ecology to understand the carbon cycle, and evolutionary history to understand how the atmosphere was oxygenated, why we can now use aerobic respiration. The chemist, as chemist, can explain how these chemicals are interacting in the Krebs cycle, but if she wants to understand why, her investigation must be drawn upwards from chemistry to the biology of organisms, and even the ecology of the relation between organisms and the evolutionary history of those relations. And I think something similar would turn out to be true in an evolutionary account of religion. I'm sure we'll be able to learn how religion comes about, but we will still be left restless with the sense that we don't fully understand the phenomenon. There's a contingency, I think, that will still elude our full understanding, and that reveals the insufficiency of our methodological atheism. We won't understand why religion was the particular pathway chosen by evolutionary history that's so ubiquitous unless we understand why this is happening as God's call to humanity to come to know Him. The evolutionary psychologist of religion who understands how religion arose but can't understand why this particular cultural phenomena is found everywhere in all cultures and in all worlds across the universe, I would say, is like the chemist who understands the Krebs cycle but without any knowledge of biology can't understand why this particular chemical reaction is happening all over the world all the time. So I think these methodological restraints that forbid an appeal to God are a good place to start. If you start asking why there is lightning and you say because Thor just threw it, you're right. The lightning is created by God. But only by suspending the appeal to God and searching for the mechanism by which it happens will you learn about the buildup of electrical charge in the atmosphere and go through the whole world of physics before you arrive back at God as the ultimate cause, both upholding the laws of physics and calling the physical world to wake into life to wake into consciousness, and to consciousness to wake up into love of God. So I would say that starting with a naturalist explanation of the world, we make great progress. But in the end, always find our method insufficient to the task of understanding the world. For we will always find that the world is not self-sufficient. It's not self-grounded. Nature cannot be the source of its own fullness of meaning. The world is dependent on something outside itself. I think we will continue to find this to be true. And an investigation of this world will always point to that outside, to the transcendent God. As naturalism grows in power over this coming century, and as science assaults the last strongholds of the theory of non-overlapping magisteria, I sure hope we recognize this truth. For a reductive naturalism that accepts nothing beyond itself is dark indeed. However, properly understood, a methodological atheistic naturalism is not a problem, for I think it will point beyond itself to a transcendent reality as the keystone for understanding. So my claim maybe is a simple one. There is no sphere of religion, say some private subjective realm of experience that can't be explained by naturalistic science. I think everything has a natural cause that can be explained in terms of lower level substrates. That's why I think the Catholic doctrine of the resurrection of the body makes more sense than a heaven of eternal sort of disembodied souls. However, while the account of how things may be complete at any level, I think to understand why they happen, we're forced to move to a higher level of organization. So I think psychology will eventually show that the biology of human beings must open onto an investigation of persons. And I think the evolutionary psychology of religion will show that psychology must open onto a theology of the eternal. In general, I think the principle is that the more complete our understanding of nature, the clearer it becomes that nature is only fully intelligible as a response to a transcendent divine call. Thus, we don't really have a simple progression from naturalism to theology after all, but more of a kind of hermeneutical circle. We understand God as the completion of the yearning within all of nature, and we understand nature as suffused with the divine call. So if we understand our methodological atheism as the proper starting point for our study of rocks and equations and stock markets, after we realize the ultimately anticipatory nature of this method, anticipatory in the sense of pointing towards transcendence, something that's transcendent to nature itself, I think we'll return to our subject matter changed in several ways. We will see the things that we study as both an orientation towards divinity and as a manifestation of the divine call. And thus we will see all things as full of value and even sacredness, whether we're doing chemistry or whatever it is. I think we'll also see the act of knowing as a participation in the divine intellect. For the intelligibility of all things is ultimately rooted in the divine nature. I think we'll see our project of inquiry into truth unified across all disciplines, but rooted not in a reductive physics, but in an uplifting theology. So one of the things that I think drives the move towards naturalism is the desire for unity and coherence in our understanding of reality, finding something that can unify all the disciplines. One possibility for that is a reduction into the laws of physics, reductive materialism. What I would hope for is that we can see a unity that binds us, all of our investigations together in theology. I think theology is the unifying discourse, not physics, in a non-reductive naturalism. Finally, I'm throwing out lots of suggestions, right? I mean, that I haven't defended, but it's just to think for conversation's sake. One last thing I'd throw out there is I think this will help clarify the relation between religious studies and theology. Religious studies we might think of as a naturalistic science that studies religion without appeal to God, just like geologists study rocks without an appeal to God, at least in the first instance. Theology is the attempt, now theology on the other hand, we could see as the attempt to come to know God and to become close to Him through academic study. But also I would hope that we would see that these things are not absolutely separate. In fact, we should all be theologians in all parts of the university. For I would say that the beauty and the intricacy and mystery of rocks and economic markets and design problems should all be revelations of God.
Do you all want to start with a comment on each other's presentations? You can do that if you'd like.
Good job. Yeah, so I'm really curious to get people's reactions and get people talking. And, yeah, and if it's late, you need to slip out those funds.
To get the ball rolling, let me make a pointed comment and say to Joshua, thanks for having this. But
yes,
I would suggest that my presentation challenges the language of thinking about religious experience on one side and scientific explanation on the other. And I think that might provide some kind of unity with some of the other conversations that we've had.
Okay, I'll also note that there's just this wonderfully interesting, but maybe needed yet to be explored thematic consistency with this two books metaphor. I have a feeling there are folks out there who will detect where they should feel where they might feel uncomfortable with the two books metaphor. After all, traditional understanding of rationality is that if reason is one thing, then you can't have two books, right? There's some problem there. But I think along with naturalized conceptions of reason, we have the idea that our brains actually keep lots of books. And so once you naturalize reason, it makes it easier to think about the rationality of keeping multiple ledgers. That is, different ways of thinking about the world, which are not compatible with each other. So my way of thinking about people as bearers of rights is very different from my way of thinking about people as, and organisms. But they cohere in my life, I hope.
And maybe it's the case of the way Dr. Bradley put it, that maybe instead of two books, which may be a little bit too clear-cut, and sort of slide into that non-overlapping magisterial image, see that there are a series of discourses, and I would fully endorse the idea of sort of ascending orders of questions, right? When you're doing physics and you want to understand chemical compounds, you got to stop doing physics and start doing chemistry. There are different orderings of questions. So as you go up,
the chemical reactions when an acid and a base make a salt, they're not violating any of the laws of physics, right? In fact, we can give physical explanations at the atomic level for what happens when that occurs, but we'll never understand it unless we can move to the principles in which chemistry is organized.
Right, so there's this sort of ascending, or you could talk about it in terms of the next order of questions sublates the earlier orders, brings everything that they are talking about into the discourse, but asks a new question. So you go to physics, chemistry, biology, botany, zoology, within biology, and then you're in psychology. And when you're talking about human beings, you're talking about rational psychology, which is a different kind of a thing that raises new kinds of questions about a particular thing that human is, which then may lead to questions about human beings asking questions of what we mean. And there you have a sort of transition point into something that's more like logical discourse, strictly speaking. But as you say, it's in a sense theology all the way along the line if theology serves that sort of universal viewpoint that draws everything into it.
Okay, so I'm
There's a
not quite in
theologian
the
wanna
same
endorse
place
that.
as you guys
No.
are. That's okay. I like the view that you're putting out. It's very nice. It's a good way for religious folks to think about the continuity of theology with science. I really like it. It's not going to work for me, but that's okay. I think we should take more questions. I mean, one concern that should be present in the audience is maybe what do you think is the big worry that people have when they hear that science has given us new knowledge about some aspect of religious experience? I mean, what are some of the worries that you think are present in this discussion about how much of religious experience science can give an account of? Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, you mentioned that you could reduce religious experience, you can reduce the subjective religious experience down to the brain structures, but that seems sort of backwards from what you were saying about that ultimately points to God. Like, it seems kind of circuitous.
Well, I think there can be a full causal explanation at the level of neural circuitry. And so you can explain, you can say, why is this person having this kind of religious experience? Well, because these certain neurons are firing.
Like why and how it comes from their being of religious experience.
Because I think we'll still be left with unanswered questions, even when we give a complete causal account. So I think we're driven up to this next level of inquiry and I think the distinction between how and why is a helpful way of thinking about that.
But for a nerf, those other questions might be existential questions, so they might be distinct levels. There might still be distinct levels, because after all, I study biology, but it doesn't tell me how to live exactly. So, there are existential value-based questions that I need to move to another level on. But I'm not on the same path to God, as a non-religious person. But I don't object to you conceptualizing it that way. I think that's a great way. That's why so much of my view depends upon religious and non-religious folks looking at each other in slightly different ways. I'm not trying to get everybody to agree to the same reality. I think that would be a mistake.
When we're talking about discourse, is this Foucauldian discourse, or what exactly are we talking about with the question of discourse?
What's the question? Sorry?
When we're using the term discourse, is it a Foucauldian discourse? Whose theory of discourse are we operating out of? I've got a second question after that. That's sort of...
I don't know if I use the word discourse, so I'm going to let you guys handle that. You talk about this.
Well, I would tie it to discipline.
Okay.
I think it just means talking to discourse.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean scholarly discourse in contrast to, say, common sense discourse. So I'm talking about a particular exigence within intellect or a certain kind of understanding. So not discourse in the sort of procedural sense.
Okay. I guess my question then comes down to the methodological distinction between the religious inquiry and the scientific inquiry, the natural and the supernatural. It would seem, it appears that the way of asking questions in the natural, if applied to the supernatural, displaces the place of God, such that God is moved over to some tangential sphere that has a controlled subjective experience or reacts in some way there, whereas it seems the medieval model, and assuming the hermeneutic model you talk about at the end, God becomes the end of all knowledge. So if we permit the naturalization of religion or theologic discussion, does that foreclose the place of putting the divine as the end of knowledge due to the methodology of science? Science itself and sort of the pervasive nature of the science.
I think you put your finger on one of the big worries in this discussion. Say that last question one more time. If you
Which part of it?
No, just the last. Sorry, if you naturalize religion.
Oh, yeah.
Say that.
If you naturalize religion, do you foreclose the possibility of putting God at the center of the universe? Does he necessarily move off to the side under the aegis of scientific inquiry, given the methodology employed by the science, or deployed, excuse me, by the science?
I think it comes down to your notion of your understanding of causation. If you understand the world such that if you can give a mechanistic causal explanation, then all the questions have been answered, and all the understanding is exhausted, then yeah, then a naturalistic explanation is going to displace the place of God. But if you understand causation in a more Aristotelian sort of way, for example, then there's still going to be then a full mechanistic causal explanation is still not going to give you the answers that you're looking for in terms of understanding, and then will bring different questions.
I think another distinction that a medieval would make also is that there's a proper setting for the order of cognition, the order of understanding, where you're asking questions based on experience, and you move up through that. And then there's a separate kind of an inquiry, or perhaps a related inquiry when you're talking about God, because what's mediated by revelation is answers to questions.
Okay.
Right? And what you're doing when you're analyzing experience is raising questions that lead to answers. So revelation starts with answers. Experience starts with questions.
I guess my follow-up question, if you don't mind. Does modern science necessarily foreclose an Aristotelian science? Does this science force us into a purely mechanicalistic understanding? Okay, that's the side that I'm...
Yeah. Yes, no, yes on foreclosing Aristotelian
Okay.
science. Yeah, I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be a small audience that's open to the other answer, but that's okay. They're very smart people, and you should go find them. And then the second part was, first part was foreclosing, second part was...
Does it necessarily stop us at the level of mechanics if we embrace modern science?
No, because all contemporary science recognizes the importance of complexity. So we're not in a mechanistic physics environment anymore. We understand that complexity introduces a lot of new things, and so no, we're not. That doesn't mean that we're stuck with the mechanistic view of the world.
Why doesn't that open a possibility of an Aristotelian notion of, well, as soon as you have agency, isn't that all we really mean in terms of final cause? I mean, if you're happy with the non-reductive notion of causality, then presumably there is interactions that emerge at higher levels of organization, such that we say an animal or a plant has principles that organize its relationships with the world. That seems...
Yeah, I'm all about all kinds of levels and not being non-reductive. That's fine, but
why does that not then mean? What do you object to in terms of the Aristotelian science? In that,
that's a big one. I don't think that there are four causes. I mean, it's kind of hard to be an Aristotelian if you don't think there's really four causes. I think things that we call purposes, like human purposes, are things that we create largely through culture, and that doesn't make them less real. But that's kind of a tangential.
yeah.
Matt,
It seems like some of this hinges on your definition of God. I mean, they're all over the board.
Right.
You say God's a he, and the chemist is a she.
Right.
But maybe not everybody thinks that God is a he.
or an agent.
Or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Right. What does theologians think about the perennial philosophy and I had contemplation, all that stuff? What do they think? It seems like we're kind of talking about one God.
Well, it's a funny thing about these discussions. I'm not in a lot of these discussions, but it's a funny thing about these discussions that they usually skirt the question of orphs, other religious folks, because it just becomes mind-boggling. I mean, if we actually counted the conceptions of deity in the room right now, it would be pretty impressive. And I think that's a wonderful thing about human beings. To me, that doesn't discredit the value of religion. But yeah, it's certainly an ambiguity in the discussion. And I think the reason it can never be resolved is because there's no process for us to come to agree about whether Buddhists are right about there being no God and no self, and Christians are right about there being a God who's a creating agent. I just don't think there's any point in us trying to come to agree about that. But maybe you guys have a method that I haven't heard of for doing that. I think the important thing today is for orphs and nerfs to figure out how to take a view of each other that is pragmatically successful in a world in which we're all mixed together. Because one of the interesting evolutionary facts, of course, is that religion came out of a part of our ancestry when we weren't mixing together, except pretty much to kill each other. So I mean, the problem of religious conflict today is really, I think, should be occupying us. And I think natural knowledge about religion really helps us establish a basis of respect. But you can't expect me to enter into your reasons for believing there's a creator God. I think they're wonderful, they're beautiful. I was raised as a Catholic. I have no hostility to anybody's religion if it's healthy. But that doesn't mean that in a discussion I have to really accept premises from your faith. I just think that's a non-starter if we're trying to get along with each other.
And maybe one of the helpful things is that starting together at the level of science, you inhabit this methodological atheism that also then leads, is sort of, can be operative in theology. An atheist only has to deny one God. A theist has to deny all kinds of gods all the time to make sure that they're hitting the right mark. So that needs to be applied then in theology as well. And so if we went around the room and, you know, there are more concepts of God in here than there are people, because each of us has a few, right? And it depends which day, which one's presiding over our religious imagination. And so the difficult work then of sort of applying this methodology in the context of theology is sort of getting straight on which God it is that we're talking about. So it's helpful within theology, but then theology does have this other set of data, which is revealed data. You know, and so there the conversation starts to separate out a little bit.
Dr. Ruffino and Dr. Bradley with regard to value. It strikes me that your first question, Dr. Ruffino, was what's the value of scientific study of religion? And then Dr. Bradley, you used the same sort of terminology when you said that the atheistic methodology might be a valuable starting place. What senses of value are you using here? It strikes me you're using them somewhat differently. And the different ends that you're valuing here with regard to the investigation whatsoever. So how would you maybe distinguish your two positions on the basis of what is valuable?
Yours was epistemic, right? I mean, yours was value in the order of knowing.
Right.
And I think mine was a value in a socio-political, pragmatic context. Like, what's the value to our problem-facing contemporary life?
So is that how we understand the endpoint of scientific investigation here? Is it going to be primarily which sense of value are we going to use?
Oh, okay. I think they're compatible. Although I don't go, I mean, I think he's setting things up in a way that I would if I were trying to connect my faith and my epistemology. And I think that's a great thing, great project. It wouldn't be what I would do, but otherwise I think they're compatible.
And perhaps something else, I mean, I think you would agree that a non-reductive, even atheistic methodology can reveal values in nature that are not merely subjective.
Right.
So one of the things that I find problematic about the non-overlapping magisteria is we tend to think values only reside in human heads. And in this way we can find values in the natural world, regardless of our ultimate agreement or disagreement about transcendent gods, right? And I think this is a place where Dr. Alfino and myself would certainly agree that what we want to do is we want to start building up a common conception of a world that has value and not to be treated in a certain kind of way without ultimately having to rely on agreement about divine reality. So we both agree that redwood trees have value, and we don't have to agree about theology in order to establish that.
And we can believe that beliefs in transcendent beings have value to communities of faith. I mean, the data on the value of religion to subjective well-being is extraordinary. Religion's a multivitamin of subjective well-being. It doesn't mean you can't get them separately without being religious. Good news for non-religious folks. But boy, one-stop shopping, man. If I were dropped in a city with no money and nothing, I would go find a church pretty fast. Try to be, honestly. They'd be nice to me either way. I mean, that's what religious people do. And they're nice to you whether you're religious or not. It's great. As long as you're respectful.
Dan, I wonder about your terminology of calling the methods of science atheistic methodology. I think it has the perhaps salutary effect of making the panel appear to agree more than it does, because it seems like you should say natural methodology, right? Because you want to argue that even the methods of science, they don't take God into account, because you're talking about secondary causes, if you want to use Aristotelian Thomistic language. But you're not, while you may be methodologically bracketing God, you're not denying God. That's atheistic methodology.
Well, this is the distinction that we didn't have time to really talk about, but naturalists make a big distinction between ontological naturalism and methodological naturalism.
Sure.
And so I think the ontological naturalist is committed to there being no God as a kind of philosophical claim, right? But most contemporary naturalists realize that's not a very scientific claim. It's a philosophical claim that doesn't have empirical language, and so most people call themselves methodological naturalists. But what does that mean? It means I only accept the methods of science. Well, that's not either.
No, I would put a twist on it. I think a more generous way to describe it, that's a legitimate definition of methodological naturalism. But I would say that a more productive definition, but looser maybe, would be that the methodological naturalist is open to any theory about anything, but it has to be investigated through methods that we associate with science. So in the scientific revolution, as we all know, lots of occult forces were investigated by science. Lots of spiritual forces were investigated by science. We couldn't find anything on them. I mean, you know, so those investigations, it's not that science prohibits hypotheses about divine beings, it's that science has had a pretty good run at them. So I do bristle at the idea that science is somehow a priori atheistic. I just don't think that's an accurate description of science. Science investigates all comers. You tell me that you've got telekinesis going, I say, come on, let's look at it, let's check it out, right? Let's see if you can get objects to move through thinking about them. That means I'm open to anything. But the fact that after a couple hundred years of investigating, we haven't been able to establish anything but natural forces from a long list we started with in the 18th, 17th, and 18th century. So it shows that science is actually open to any hypothesis. But it does limit its investigation by its own methods, and that is a constraint. That's what defines it as science. You can't hold that against it. That is a limitation of its investigation.
But that's only determined retrospectively, right? I mean,
You mean at the outcome?
So you can't appeal to anything that has sort of been foreclosed on by a scientific method or...
No, you can open up research topics. If you want to start looking at cold fusion, I don't know if you guys are too young to remember this. Some researchers in Utah thought they had cold fusion. Man, it would have been the breakthrough of the millennia. Well, they couldn't make it happen while people were watching. That was a problem. You know, so it's not like the scientific community isn't open to anything you say you can do or show about nature or reality. It's just that you got to show it, and if you can't, you get embarrassed. Unlike in philosophy, you just have to talk about it.
I guess I'm hearing methodological atheism as sort of
Yeah.
an epistemology that prescinds from the God question, or that doesn't appeal to it precipitously or allow it to prejudice the inquiry from the start. So use all the relevant methods to what you're working on, without sort of asking, what does this tell me about the nature of God? Now you might start to do that, and insofar as you do start to do that, you're moving into a different area of discourse. There you're starting to theological reflection.
Yeah, I meant only to emphasize the point that science is neutral rather than atheistic.
Right.
In other words, it sets aside, it says that with respect to natural phenomena, we're going to look for natural explanations. But it doesn't say, it doesn't declare that there are no influences operating from supernatural sources.
Right. It's not a prejudgment either way.
Well,
So
I don't know,
it's
because it's saying
methodological posture.
even if there is some kind of supernatural force at work, it will also have a natural mechanistic causal, or a sort of lower level explanation. And so we're going to prescind from making these kinds of higher level, just like, you know, you wouldn't want to say, the physicist still wants to know how the atoms are working in a chemical reaction. And so you can say, well, don't, as a physicist, don't tell me your story about chemistry, because I want to know what's happening with molecular physics.
Yeah, but that's not anti-chemistry. That's instead focusing the inquiry in a different way.
That's
You wouldn't say physicists are opposed to chemists doing what chemists do.
Right, so it's only methodological atheism rather than...
Yeah. So maybe we should capitalize the A. There's a capital A atheism.
We can make a dash. Cut
Oh,
off
as
the-
in
that.
the alpha
A
privative,
dash.
as in not theism? Is that what you mean?
It's not making those appeals to
Yeah.
causation. We're trying to understand phenomena.
Okay, that's not the conventional meaning of atheism, though. You mean without making any appeal to, rather than denying the existence of gods.
Yeah, but people who write about Thomas Aquinas, though, talk about him as a methodological atheist. I mean, that's prior to the 1960s, so maybe it's different now. But I mean, that was a way of describing the theological method that you would start with. And the beginning of your inquiry would not be prejudiced by too quick an assertion of something about God. So if we understand it that way, but you're right that now it's a more problematic term, and so we have to maybe be a little more careful in how it's applied. But I would want to kind of embrace it in a way, though, right? As a theologian, too, that you got to negate a lot of gods along the way. I mean, Augustine does that, right?
Right.
So, one of the main researchers in what's called cognitive science of religion is a guy named Justin Barrett, who's one of the few self-confessed Christians in research in this. And the way he describes it is that science is that his use of cognitive science to study religion is agnostic. It sets aside the question of God. So it's neither. It's just not investigating that hypothesis. And I think that's more consistent with the history of science on divine processes and beings. I just don't think religious folks should look to science for substantiation of their belief in divine processes. We have tried that.
Meaning what you're saying is natural theology is a failed project?
No, I don't. I need to understand it better. I don't understand natural theology the way you guys do. But I don't think there's anything wrong with religious folks looking for evidence of the divine in nature. I think they should. I think when my students tell me that they have religious experiences when they're backpacking, that makes a lot of sense. That's not a problem. So I didn't mean to imply that. I meant to say that you shouldn't be looking. That if you're looking to science to prove whether there is a God or whether there is another order of causation, you should read the history on the question, because that hasn't turned out well for documenting another order of causation. That doesn't mean that religious folks should stop believing in that. That's a hard distinction, because a lot of the new atheists think, well, if there isn't evidence for it, it's irrational to believe it. That's a very quick inference, in my opinion, and it's an illicit one. It doesn't make sense given what we know about the mind. Given what we know about the mind, there's just too many things going on for us to say that there should be one consistent set of beliefs, much less that they should be based on what science tells us is real. I mean, that's just too many steps to make in one shot.
Well, I don't know much about Thomism, but it seems to me that even traditional natural theology isn't predicated so much on using nature to prove God, but almost an argument from that the understanding of nature always leaves something lacking. And it's that lack, it's the incompleteness that leaves the intellectual curiosity restless and searches for a completion, which to me, it's not a proof, but it is an indication that comes from natural science, based on natural science's failure to completely explain natural phenomena. I think there's always a kind of lack in natural explanations. That is what is the driving, motivating factor towards asking theological questions.
And the basic insight in terms of natural theology is the intelligibility of the created word.
Right.
That's the thing that gets the ball rolling. So you're not looking for some specific information that says, oh, there's God.
Well, William Paley did, but that project seems... And
Well,
intelligent design theorists are making the same move. Yeah.
I think that's a loser.
I don't think you need to do that.
Yeah, I think we don't agree with that.
Even if you were to set God aside and say you take a naturalist approach to say explaining a system like the Spokane River, you were to study it in depth, I think you would eventually come to the realization that it's bad to put paint in the Spokane River for multiple reasons. And so that, in a sense, that's a value. And so even though you set God aside, I feel like you'll still arrive at that question that Dr. Bradley, you were talking about, that demands completeness. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, even if you try to set God aside, can you do that in the end? Because I feel like science is ultimately going to recognize that it is incomplete to a certain extent.
Right, I think it's that incompleteness to the story that drives you towards theology. That ultimately raises the level of inquiry to a higher level.
Yeah,
Right,
I
for
don't
me,
think it
it's not, but.
I don't think it discredits science.
No.
I'm just saying, I think when you arrive at the idea of a value, then you ask, well, we know how it's bad to pour paint in the Spokane River, but why is that so?
No, we know why it's bad. It makes people sick and it's bad for fishing and all that. I mean, I think it's fine to develop it the way Dan's suggesting, but for me, values come out of human culture. I mean, there's a human culture for discerning a good way to live. Where should we put the sewage treatment plant? Should we put it upriver or downriver? You know, we've worked that one out. So I think there's all kinds of ways that culture develops discussions about values. I don't think you need to necessarily say that you're on the road to discovering God. But if you're a religious person and you want to see a continuity between natural knowledge and values, and you want to intellectually and affectively take in this vision of reality, that is what you should do. So I definitely don't, because I don't do the values problem the same way Dan does, doesn't mean I don't think he should do it that way. And that's puzzling, because we tend to think we ought to settle this question once and for all for everybody. And I just think that's really a bad idea.
Is the former one you mentioned reductionistic still?
No, because I don't think you can begin to understand culture without taking it seriously as an extraordinarily complex level of organization that humans achieved, and other animals, social animals like insects and wasps and bees, have achieved through evolution. And once culture comes into play, there's an incredible range of variation. So culture brings free moves. Anthropologists like to talk about how, and that starts to explain why you get Buddhists and Christians, right? Cultures solve problems in different ways. And so you get diverse value codes, you get diverse views about how to live, and that's part of the natural world for the worldview I'm representing. So yeah, I don't think there's a problem saying where values come from without God, but I think it's great if your orientation to the world is one where values are understood in a beautiful vision that includes a loving God who wants peace for everybody.
But the price you pay for that pluralism is foreclosing on the idea of total coherence.
Well,
it seems to me
say that, I feel pretty coherent about my beliefs.
Well, the naturalists can have an absolutely unified account of reality if it's reductive, if it wants to reduce everything down to the general physics. But I think we all suggest that's not a very good way of thinking about it. We don't want to be reductive.
Good. That's great. Finally, a disagreement.
But
no, I mean, I just said natural. I just gave a naturalist view where culture is not reduced; it's a non-reductive
no,
view.
I'm saying, and the price you pay for that is then failing to give a unified account of reality. We have to choose.
Let me just see if I can put that in nerf language. that's an ERF telling a nerf that their views are really incomplete and incoherent. And I will take exception to that. I don't have a complete story about the nature of culture. Science is very new in this area. That's wonderful. I don't have to overplay my hand, but I do not believe that a naturalistic understanding of reality, including human culture and values, is an incomplete understanding, fundamentally incomplete understanding of reality.
But it's going to be discrete and discontinuous. You're going to say they're
No, it's going to be
values.
holistic and complex. That's what's in fashion.
So what makes it holistic?
Because we're trying to put everything together. We're trying to figure out how it is, given that we've evolved the way we have, we can live in healthy, happy communities in a global environment. So it's holistic because the task of life is to live together, and if you don't have to believe this, you can believe that war is our legacy, but I think the task is to try to live together in a way that develops human capacities, and war is inimical to that for me. So I would make a brief for a holistic understanding of how we should live together, which respects the diverse ways that people put their metaphysics and theology together, but which requires us to talk together about the world we inhabit together. And that's a world described by observation, normal discourse about what's good in life, and science.
So we've reached an ultimate value position which the believer would identify with God. So is that your God?
Well, it's not an object of faith, but it's a.
But it kind of is. You said there's an alternative explanation.
Yeah, it's a paradigm for understanding value in the world, and in that sense, it's parallel to a theistic paradigm for understanding value in the world. it does the same work for me in many ways that the theist's holistic vision of reality does for him or her. So yeah, I think that's right.
So that's what Augustine would call God. Show me what you love and I'll show you God. The church of all.
I don't know what the object is. I don't really know what the object is. This is really very promising. Wait, hold on to that thought. But I just before we start the church, I need to know what it believes. So I guess I'll start now. I guess I get to say, right? So what is this God that I believe in?
It's a process.
Yeah, I could go Whitehead. I could be a Whiteheadian, I guess.
But forget Whitehead, just in terms of the conversation.
I don't have an article of faith about it. All I know is it's worked pretty well. I'm trying to understand the world through observation and
How do you
hypothesis.
distinguish that from a faith position?
Because because none of my claims require membership in a special community, but faith claims require membership in a special community. And their validity doesn't cut across. No, it's not. It's a community we all inhabit. You take your kid for antibiotics, you are in the community. You know, and so it's not a community that has different validity criteria for its beliefs. So it's not. I really don't think it's a faith in an object or a process. I do have a lot of hopes I can start telling you guys about, but this may not be the time. I hope the world is intelligible. I hope we'll understand how to get along together. But whether I know that we'll do that, I don't know. Some days I just don't think it's happening.
But, I get with the talk about as far as having a, for me, one of the problems that seems to arise for me as far as talking about having a naturalized religion for a traditional Christian theist, what that ends up doing, I think, at least for myself, that means that it ends up kind of truncating a lot of the reality claims that I make, right? And if it does that, one of the things I think about is that in order to live together at that point, like if I'm going off your position, Dr. Alfino, if I have to like truncate a lot of the claims that I make about reality, it seems that I'm ordering my belief to a different teleological position. And I don't know how, that seems to be kind of fundamentally problematic for a Christian theist, and it doesn't necessarily seem like getting along as much as it means compromising via taking out organs from the whole belief system. They're necessary organs, and things that have at least somewhat legitimate claims on reality about how, like for example, using cosmological arguments for understanding, different facets of intelligibility, these different things about. I mean, it doesn't really seem like you can reduce religion simply to ethics. I mean, for a Christian theist.
I don't think Christian theists should. I have a weird position, so I know it's hard for me to kind of communicate it. But I'm not suggesting that the Christian theists should somehow stop talking about their values in relation to God. I think that would be like giving up your faith. So yeah, I'm not saying that. But your question's really good. If I understood the first part of your question, it was, is it really fair to ask the Christian to just interact with the non-religious folks only on the things they have in common? Isn't that like truncating part of their belief? And that is a serious problem. But I don't know what the alternative is. I can't grant the validity of 600 different sets of beliefs in a conversation. I don't know how the conversation would proceed. There's a philosopher, Owen Flanagan, who was actually an early teacher of mine, who wrote a recent book which is partially successful. We used to read it in the Philosophy Pro Seminar, called The Really Hard Problem, and Owen Flanagan. And he's really interested in this problem of how people with fundamentally different orientations toward the world are going to inhabit a common world, and what that conversation is going to look like. What are they going to have to grant for each other? And I think that's sort of where my orientation is. It's not about telling Christians that they should realize that science has told them something about what they should give up believing. That was what I represented as standard but inferior hypothesis. So I'm sorry if it's a weird belief, but a weird system, but that's how you start new religions.
Dr. Alfino, you mentioned that science attempted to explain these different occult activities. Let's take, for instance, demonic possession, which is held in Christianity. So science finds no evidence for demonic possession. Does the theologian then at that point breathe a sigh of relief and say, thank goodness, science doesn't have any, and I still have a job? Or what is the response to that?
Funny stuff. That's a really good test. How's church thinking on that? If people,
Well, it depends on who you ask, but one thing that the Christian has to kind of be all right with is that once you say a person rose from the dead, some bets are off. So you have to kind of be open to the possibility of what a scientist would consider strictly supernatural. I think I can say about that. But that is part of the point of making a separation. Now, on the other hand, there are all kinds of theologians, biblical scholars who want to read those passages of the Bible in sort of a more contemporary scientific sense. So it's articulated in terms of demonic possession, we would understand in terms of mental illness or something like this. I'm not sure if that's adequate for biblical text. But also then you might take a sort of more narrative approach to those passages in the text and say that this is a vehicle for making some larger point. It's not necessarily about whether or not there's this agent in there. But Christians do affirm the existence of these things called angels and demons, and they're part of the natural order. Actually, they're not supernatural. God is. And so they're created entities, and so you can start to talk about them in terms of created entity, the way that we talk about psychic disturbances in psychology, and that wouldn't necessarily sort of undo the metaphorical usage of demon, because
well, that's one of the things we do, right? We make them, we go from literal to metaphoric, right? So a trivial example I'll throw in is we still say God bless you or bless you when people sneeze, right? In European culture, I think that was understood as a spiritual blessing to protect you from the re-infestation of a spirit that you had sneezed out, right? So we still say bless you. It's still a nice thing to say when people sneeze, I think. I still say it. But the culture has moved on. We just don't have a literal understanding of demons in your stomach anymore. And you're welcome to have that, by the way. Again, that's the tolerance thing. But maybe demonic possession will be like that. We'll say, oh, maybe at some point the church will stop licensing exorcists. And they'll just say, well, we used to think of that kind of literally, and now we should really think of it in terms of spiritual health. We should say, look, when you're really sick spiritually, it looks like you've got a demon in you. And that would make sense.
and that is actually how it's described
Yeah.
in the church.
Is that right?
Yeah, so it's not, you're not, even in the course of an exorcism, you're not going to see the thing leave and walk out the room. All right, I'll see you later. You're talking about spiritual healing of a psychic problem. Part of the problem is language here too, right? Soul is psyche, and this has all been sort of co-opted into different ways of talking about it. But, so these are problems of mind, problems of psyche. And so the best place maybe to look at this is sort of more Greek patristic writing on demonic possession or what demons are. And that there's a very sort of healthy psychology if you look sort of in the early Greek ascetic works, ascetical manuals, that we might transpose into language from contemporary psychology, but it would be saying the same thing in a sense. So, demons are far more intractable than little dudes with pitchforks. Right? It'd be nice if they were that simple.
Right.
Right? But it takes a long time to work through the problem of spiritual disturbance, precisely because they're far more complicated. If we're giving that idea sort of its full adequacy and understanding, then this little sort of extrinsic thing that's just inside of me, all I have to do is get rid of it. It's much more difficult than that. And so in a sense, there's important insights from psychology that can help in developing spiritual health. And that's what, that's partially what goes on in Ignatian spirituality, and in this discernment of spirits. Is that very difficult work of figuring out what are my motivations. That's what a demon is. Socrates' understanding of demon. Right? That's a more helpful way, perhaps, of thinking about that than a little dude And you can imagine it that way, right? And you gotta take the image and set it aside, so that's the intelligibility that the image is trying to do.
Well, I'm not sure what we should read with ending with the diabolical here, but we're out of time. Thanks to our speakers. Let's thank the panel, please.